The truth is, a man can spend his whole life believing he's the one holding the pen, signing the documents, building the empire, and never once notice that the woman across the table from him has been quietly inheriting something he could never touch. Bennett Ashworth did not notice. He had not noticed for 52 years. And on that grey Tuesday morning in March of 2025, in a wood-panelled law office on Bull Street in Savannah, Georgia, he still did not notice. He sat with his elbows on the polished mahogany, a Mont Blanc pen in his right hand, his reading glasses low on his nose, and he did not raise his eyes when he spoke the words that would, without him knowing it, set the rest of this story in motion. "Keep the ruin if you love it that much." That was all he said. 8 words delivered in the same flat baritone he had used in courtrooms across the Low Country for 40 years to bury opposing counsel under the weight of his own boredom. 8 words, and he did not even glance up to see how they landed on the woman who had shared his bed since 1972. Margery Hollis. Ashworth, 80 years old that month, sat very straight in the leather chair across from him. Her hands rested on top of her pocketbook, folded one over the other, the way her grandmother had taught her to sit when she was a little girl in church. She tilted her head a few degrees to the right, the way she always did now, because the cataract in her left eye had thickened into something like a milky pearl, and she had to angle her face like an old bird to focus the good eye, the right one, on whatever she wanted to see clearly. That was how she looked at her husband on that morning, from the side, with the eye that still worked. She did not cry, she did not flinch, she did not argue. She simply listened as her own attorney, a tired man named Hadley, who had been recommended to her by a neighbor, and who had done, she would later understand, the absolute minimum required of him, slid the settlement papers across the table. She listened as he summarized what she was giving up and what she was keeping, although the word keeping was generous because in plain language, she was keeping almost nothing. Bennett kept the house in the historic district of Savannah, the one on East Jones Street with the iron gate and the camellia bushes and the side garden where she had grown her tomatoes for 40 years. He kept both checking accounts and the brokerage account at the firm downtown. He kept the lot in Statesboro that they had been planning to sell. He kept the Cadillac. He kept the walnut dining set that had belonged to his mother. He kept, in short, the visible accumulation of a life lived together. Because in 52 years of marriage, every deed, every signature card, every title had been quietly arranged to be in his name alone and Margery, who had signed whatever he put in front of her with a small pencil X to show her, where had never once questioned it. What she was given in exchange was a single property, an old limestone house on the salt marsh at the edge of a forgotten coastal town called Cypress Landing, 90 miles south of where they sat. A house Bennett had referred to throughout their entire marriage as a rotting pile by a salt marsh, a house he had never set foot in, a house he believed on that Tuesday morning to be worth less than the trouble of driving down there to look at it. He even said so out loud into the silence of the conference room. He said without raising his eyes from the papers, "I'm leaving her the beach place so nobody can say I wasn't fair, so she sees I'm not a bad man. So she sees." As if she were a witness to his goodness, as if she had been put on this earth to verify with her one good eye the decency of Bennett Ashworth. Margery picked up the pen her attorney offered her. She tilted her head, found the line, and in a hand that did not tremble, she signed her name. 2 words, Margery Ashworth. She put the pen down. She picked up her pocketbook. She stood. She did not look at her husband as she walked out of the conference room and down the marble stairs, and out into the white March sunlight of Bull Street, where the live oaks were just beginning to push out their new leaves, and the air smelled, the way Savannah always smells in March of camellia and Old River. She walked 2 blocks to the bus stop on Liberty Street. She did not cry on the bus. She did not cry on the connection. She did not cry when she got off near the small rented apartment her youngest daughter had set up for her on the west side of town. She made herself a cup of tea, and she sat by the window and watched the cardinals on the feeder. And only when the sun had gone down and the apartment was dark did she allow herself very quietly to weep. And even then, she wept the way women of her generation had been taught to weep, which is to say silently with one hand pressed over her mouth, so that no one in the neighboring units would hear and feel obligated to come check on her. She was 80 years old. She had just lost almost everything she had spent her adult life building, and she had walked out of that office with her back straight, Because women like Margery Ashworth do not let the world see them break in the daylight. But here is the thing. Here is the thing that Bennett Ashworth, in all his 40 years of practicing law, in all his careful arrangement of deeds and signature cards, in all his slow and steady accumulation of the visible assets of their life together, had failed to understand. Here is the thing he did not know on that Tuesday morning, and would not know for many months yet, and which when he finally did learn, it would be too late. The limestone house on the salt marsh in Cypress Landing, Georgia, had never been his to give. It had never been part of their marital estate at all. It had never, not for one single day in 52 years, been something he had any legal claim to whatsoever. Because under the laws of the state of Georgia, property that one spouse receives by inheritance or by gift before or during a marriage remains the separate property of that spouse. It does not become marital. It cannot be divided in a divorce. The other spouse has no claim on it, no interest in it, no right to it at all, unless the spouse who received it has expressly given that right away in writing, which Margery never had. And the limestone house in Cypress Landing had come to Margery Hollis from her grandmother, Adelaide Hollis, in the spring of 1972, 2 months before the wedding, in a transaction that Adelaide had quietly executed at a notary's office on Abercorn Street in Savannah, with the help of an old country lawyer who understood exactly what she was doing and why. Bennett, being an attorney himself, knew all of this. Of course he knew. He had known it from the day he married her. That was why he had not even attempted to claim the house in the settlement. Not because he was being generous, not because he was leaving her something out of decency or 52 years of shared sacrifice, but because legally he could not have taken it from her if he had wanted to. The house was hers, untouchable, locked away from him as completely as if it sat in a vault on the bottom of the ocean. What he did instead, being the man he was take everything else. Every single thing that could be taken. And then he handed her the one thing he could not take and called it generosity. And he sat there in his $1,000 suit on Bull Street in Savannah, and he believed with the full force of his 84-year-old conviction that he had won. He had not won. He had simply not yet understood what he had thrown away. But to understand any of this, you have to understand who Margery Ashworth was before she was Margery Ashworth. Because she had not always been a woman to whom a husband throws scraps. She had been once something else entirely. She was born in 1945 in a small clapboard house in the Red Clay Hill country north of Macon, Georgia. The only child of a man named Wilton Hollis and a woman named Lucinda. The Hollis family had been in the early decades of the 20th century, what people in that part of the world used to call comfortable. Not rich exactly, but comfortable. They had made their money in the resin years back when the longleaf pine forests of South Georgia ran with naval stores with turpentine and rosin. And a man with a wagon and a good back could pull a living out of the trees that was sometimes better than what the cotton planters were making. Margery's grandfather on her mother's side had owned a small turpentine still outside of Vidalia, and her grandmother Adelaide had grown up in the kind of household where there were 2 pianos and a black cook named Ophelia, who had stayed on long after the Civil War for reasons that nobody in the family ever talked about. And the daughters were sent to a finishing school in Macon, and the sons went to the University of Georgia, and everybody summered when it got too hot inland at the limestone house on the salt marsh in Cypress Landing. That house, that ruin, that rotting pile by a salt marsh. In the resin years, when Cypress Landing was still a working port, and the schooners came in from Charleston and Jacksonville, and the cypress trees in the back swamp were full of egrets in the spring, that house had been a fine summer place. 2 stories of cut limestone hauled up the coast by barge from Florida with a wide front porch under arches of native cedar, and a long rear lot that ran back to the edge of the salt marsh, where the fiddler crabs came out at low tide by the thousands. By the 1950s, when Margery was a little girl, the resin years were long over. The longleaf forests had been cut and not replanted. The turpentine stills had gone silent. The port at Brunswick had taken whatever shipping business Cypress Landing once had, and Cypress Landing had settled into the long, slow sleep of a coastal town the world had forgotten about. The big houses from the resin years sat there falling down a little more each summer, and the children of the families who had once owned them mostly moved away to Atlanta or Savannah or Jacksonville, and only came back the way Margery's mother came back in August to escape the inland heat. Adelaide Hollis still owned the limestone house then. She was a widow by that time, the turpentine still long since sold off the money mostly spent. But she had kept the house in Cypress Landing because she used to say a woman ought to keep one thing in this life that is hers and nobody else's. Adelaide was a thin, sharp-eyed woman with hair the color of pewter and a way of looking at men when they spoke that had been known in her younger days to silence a room. She had been left a widow at 51. She had buried two of her own sons, one in the Pacific in 1944 and one to drink in 1958. She had outlived most of her sisters, and what she had left at the end of her life was the Limestone house and a granddaughter named Margery, whom she loved with the fierce, watchful, careful love of an old woman who has seen too many of her own people lose what they should have kept. It was Adelaide who first gave Margery the taste of sassafras tea. This is important, so listen. The sassafras tree grew wild in the back lot of the Cypress Landing house, the way it grows wild all through the Georgia low country. A slender tree with leaves shaped like mittens, and from its roots you could brew a tea that smelled like root beer, and the deep woods at once slightly bitter, slightly sweet. And Adelaide made it for the child Margery every August afternoon on the back porch, and served it in a small carved cup made of black walnut that her own grandfather had turned on a foot lathe in 1869. That cup, that dark-grained little wooden cup, it would outlive every other piece of furniture, every painting, every silver service, every other inheritable thing the Hollis family ever owned. It would outlive Adelaide and Wilton and Lucinda. It would sit in a cardboard box in a closet in Savannah for 50 years. And in the end, in a way that even Adelaide could not have foreseen on those long August afternoons in the 1950s, it would save Margery's life. Margery grew up. She was a bright child, a reader, a girl who liked nothing better than a stack of library books and a porch swing, and the long summer hours. Her father, Wilton, who had inherited very little but a name and a stack of unpaid debts when the resin business collapsed, was nevertheless determined that his daughter would have what he had not. He sent her to the Georgia State College for Women in Milledgeville on a scholarship and a great deal of his own scraping and saving. And she came out in 1966 with a teaching certificate. They sent her up into the hill country of North Georgia, into the foothills of the Appalachians to teach in the kind of two-room schoolhouse that still existed in those years, with a potbelly stove in the corner, and the children walking 3 miles each way on red clay roads, some of them barefoot in September, to learn to read. And she was good at it. Lord, she was good at it. The old people in those mountain towns would still, 50 years later, remember Miss Hollis, the slim young teacher, with the careful hands who could make a 6-year-old who had never held a book before sound out the word cat by Christmas, and who never raised her voice at any of them. Not once, not ever, because she had figured out something most teachers never figure out, which is that you cannot shame a child into learning. You can only love them into it. I want you to hold on to this because it matters. Margery Hollis was not an ignorant woman. She was not some country girl who had been kept from her letters. She was a state-educated teacher with a fine intelligence and a deep understanding of human nature. She could read a document if she sat down and made herself read it with as much comprehension as any lawyer. And the despoiling that happened to her over 52 years of marriage was not the despoiling of a fool. It was the despoiling of an educated woman who had been raised the way her entire generation of Southern women had been raised to believe that the husband was the head, and a wife who questioned what her husband arranged was a wife who did not trust him, and a wife who did not trust her husband was no kind of wife at all. That is the trap. That is the trap that closes on women like Margery, one signature at a time over 40 years. And by the time she realizes she's in it, she's 80 years old and she has signed everything away. She met Bennett Ashworth in 1971. She was 26 years old that summer, teaching her 6th year in a school outside the town of Blue Ridge. Bennett was a Savannah attorney, 30 years old, fresh out of the University of Georgia Law School, and full of the early ambition that would later harden into something colder. He had come up into the mountains on a land dispute representing a group of small landholders in a quiet timber case against a paper company. He was in those days the kind of young lawyer who liked to think of himself as a defender of the little man, although the little man was already paying him a fee that would have surprised the little man if he had known the full sum. Margery first saw him in the diner across from the schoolhouse on a Friday afternoon in September. He was wearing a seersucker suit that did not belong in the mountains, and a pair of brown wingtips that were entirely the wrong shoe for that red clay. And he was reading a stack of papers and drinking sweet tea. And when she came in to pick up her supper, he looked up and saw her. And he later said many times in the way men say these things, when they want a story to sound like a love story, that he had known right then. He courted her properly. He drove up from Savannah on weekends. He wrote her letters on cream-colored stationery from his firm. He met her father Wilton, who by that time was an old man with a heart condition and a great deal of worry about what would happen to his only daughter when he was gone, and Bennett, charming and ambitious, and a member of the Georgia Bar, looked to Wilton Hollis like exactly the kind of safety net a father wants for his child. They were married on the 15th of April 1972 in the small Methodist church in Margery's hometown. And they were married because it was Georgia and it was 1972. And nobody told her any different under the default marital property arrangement of the state, which meant nothing in particular at the time, but which Bennett, being a lawyer, understood perfectly. Now here is where the story turns. Here is the second hinge of it. The one that nobody noticed at the time, not Bennett, not Margery, not Wilton, not anybody at the wedding. 2 months before the ceremony in February of 1972, Margery's grandmother, Adelaide, drove herself down from Macon to Savannah in her old Buick. She was 73 years old that winter. She had a pain in her left hip that she had not told anybody about, and a hard certainty about something that she had also not told anybody about. And she had made an appointment on her own with an attorney on Abercorn Street named Mr. Pemberton, who had drawn up wills for the Hollis family for 40 years. What she did in that office on a Wednesday afternoon in February of 1972 was establish an irrevocable living trust. The trust was funded with a single asset, the Limestone house on the salt marsh in Cypress Landing, Georgia, together with the lot it sat on running back to the edge of the marsh. The beneficiary of the trust was Margery Hollis, soon to be Margery Ashworth. The terms specified that the property was being conveyed as a gift to Margery alone, free and clear, and that no future spouse, no future creditor, no future court of any kind would have any claim or interest in the property whatsoever, except through Margery herself by her own express written consent. Mr. Pemberton, who had been practicing law in Savannah since before Adelaide's husband was buried, looked at the 73-year-old widow across his desk and asked her quietly why she was doing this. Why now? Why before the wedding? And Adelaide, who had buried 2 sons and a husband, and most of her sisters who had watched her own mother be left destitute by a husband she had trusted, who had seen in her long life every variety of betrayal. A man can visit upon a woman, looked back at Mr. Pemberton and said very simply, "Because the boy is a lawyer, and I have known a great many lawyers in my time, Mr. Pemberton, and I would like my granddaughter to have one piece of ground in this world that no lawyer can ever talk her out of." Mr. Pemberton, who was himself a lawyer, did not argue with her. He drew up the papers. Adelaide signed them. They were filed and recorded in the Chatham County Land Records on the 21st of February 1972, and a certified copy was placed in a sealed envelope which Adelaide carried on the morning of the wedding into Margery's room at the small bed and breakfast where the bride was dressing. She handed the envelope to her granddaughter. She kissed her on the forehead, and she said in the dry, sharp voice that Margery would remember for the rest of her life, "This is yours, child, yours alone, not his. No matter what comes, this is your ground, and no man, no court, no living soul can take your ground from you. Do you understand me?" Margery, who was 26 years old and in love, and entirely focused on the bouquet of dogwood her cousin was arranging on the dresser, took the envelope and said, "Yes, ma'am." She understood. She kissed her grandmother. She did not open the envelope. She did not read the papers. She put them in the cedar box at the bottom of her hope chest, the one where she kept her mother's pearls and her father's pocket watch. And she did not look at them again for 52 years. Adelaide Hollis died 14 months later, in the spring of 1973, of the heart condition that ran in her family. She was buried in the cemetery outside of Vidalia next to her husband and her 2 sons. And the limestone house on the salt marsh stayed locked up, mostly empty, mostly forgotten. While Margery's life as Mrs. Bennett Ashworth unfolded in Savannah, in a different house, in a different life, 90 miles north of where her grandmother had put her ground. The marriage was in the early years what people would have called a good one. Bennett rose quickly in the Savannah bar. By 1974, he had moved from the timber and land cases of the small lawyers up into the more lucrative work of commercial litigation, representing the kind of clients whose names were printed in gold on the office door. By 1976, they had bought the house on East Jones Street. Their first child, a son they named Coleman, was born in 1974. Their second, a son named Garrett, in 1977. Their third and last, a daughter named Wynne, in 1979. Margery, after Coleman was born, did not return to teaching. Bennett did not exactly forbid it. He simply observed over the course of several quiet conversations across the dinner table that a professional man's wife in Savannah did not generally teach school, and that there would be a kind of talk among his colleagues' wives that he would prefer she did not subject herself to. And Margery, who loved her work, who had been better at it than at almost anything else in her life, who had felt more like herself standing in front of a chalkboard than she had ever felt anywhere else in the world, set down the chalk and stayed home. She took up quilting instead, not the cheerful patchwork kind of quilting that the magazines were full of in those years, but the old slow hand-stitched low-country quilts that her grandmother Adelaide had taught her as a girl. She quilted in the front parlor of the house on East Jones in the morning light, through the lace curtains, and over the years she became among a certain small circle of women in Savannah and Charleston who knew about such things, quietly famous for her work. Her quilts hung in 2 museums by 1995. She never made very much money from them because she gave most of them away. But the work itself, the slow rhythm of needle and thread, the hours of silence by the window, kept some part of her alive that Bennett did not see and did not understand, and would not have valued if he had. What she did not see, what she did not allow herself to see, which is a different thing, was the way Bennett was, over those same years, putting everything into his own name. The house on East Jones, deeded to him alone. The brokerage account in his name. The investment properties they acquired over the years, all in his name. The cars. The accounts. The deed to the small piece of land in Statesboro they bought as a tax shelter in 1991. Everything. Everything. And whenever a document required her signature, because in Georgia certain things did still require the wife to sign, Bennett would bring the document home already filled out, already with a small pencil X showing her exactly where. And he would say in his careful baritone, "Sign here, Margery. It's just for the bank." And she would sign, and she would sign, and she would sign. 30,000 mornings of signing. This is the thing. And I want you to sit with this, because it is the marrow of the whole story, and I do not want you to miss it. A woman like Margery Ashworth is not robbed all at once in a single act of theft on a single afternoon in a lawyer's office. A woman like Margery Ashworth is robbed across 40 years, one signature at a time, each one so small that it does not feel like anything. And by the time the sum of all those signatures is a life entirely signed away, she's old. And the man who arranged it is sitting in a leather chair on Bull Street in Savannah, refusing to lift his eyes to look at her, and there is no going back. Bennett did not rob Margery on that Tuesday morning in March of 2025. He had been robbing her quietly and with great patience since 1972. The morning in March was simply the settling of the account. 3 children and 3 different reckonings. Coleman, the eldest, who had gone to law school like his father, and joined Bennett's firm as a junior partner by 2005, and who was by every measure that mattered Bennett's son in every way except the strictly biological. Coleman had taken his father's side from the first conversation about the divorce. He had, even Wynne would later discover, helped draft the settlement agreement. The cold, methodical, surgically unfair settlement agreement. His own mother, his own hand on the pen. Wynne, the youngest. The daughter, the registered nurse who had moved up to Macon and married a man named Boone and raised her own 2 children, there had been on her mother's side from the moment she understood what was happening. It was Wynne who found her the apartment in Savannah after the divorce. It was Wynne who sat with her in the dark in those first weeks. It was Wynne who eventually would speak the sentence that turned the whole story. And Garrett. Garrett, the middle child, the contractor. The one who had never gone to college, who had built his own small construction company out of a single pickup truck in 1998 and grown it into a real business in the years since. Garrett was the question mark. Garrett had been quiet through the entire divorce. He had not chosen sides openly. He had taken his mother out to dinner once in March and asked her how she was doing and listened and paid the check and driven away. And that had been the extent of it. Margery, who loved all 3 of her children with the particular helpless love of a mother, who knows she has lost some of them, already had told herself that Garrett was at least not against her. It was Wynne in the second week of April who told her otherwise. They were sitting on the small couch in the rented apartment in Savannah late on a Sunday afternoon. The light was going. Wynne had driven down from Macon to spend the day. She had brought a casserole. She had refilled the bird feeder on the little balcony, and she had been working herself up all afternoon to tell her mother something that she did not want to tell her, but that she had decided her mother had the right to know. "Mama," Wynne said, "I need to tell you something about Garrett." Margery, who was 80 years old, who had just signed her life away, who had survived almost everything by then, turned her head and angled her good right eye on her youngest daughter and waited. Wynne told her. Garrett had made an arrangement with his father 6 months before the divorce was filed. Garrett's construction company was going to receive the lot in Statesboro transferred at a nominal price to be developed into a small residential subdivision. In exchange, Garrett had agreed to remain neutral throughout the divorce proceedings, not to take his mother's side, not to speak against the settlement, not to interfere. Wynne had learned this from her husband's cousin, who worked at the county recorder's office in Statesboro, and who had noticed the deed transfer and the unusual price and had mentioned it in passing at a Sunday dinner. Margery did not cry. She did not say anything for a long moment. She looked out the window at the cardinals on the feeder, and she said very quietly, "So it isn't only Coleman." "No, Mama," Wynne said. "It isn't only Coleman." Margery sat with that. She sat with the fact that 2 of her 3 children had in different ways chosen to be on the side of the man who had spent 52 years quietly emptying her out. She sat with the fact that the only one who had stayed with her, the only one she could be sure of, was the daughter sitting next to her on the couch with red eyes and a hand on her mother's hand. And then Wynne said the sentence. The sentence that the entire story turns on. The sentence that Adelaide Hollis, dead 52 years by then, had been waiting in some quiet place beyond the world for someone finally to say. "Mama," Wynne said, "why don't you go down to the house in Cypress Landing? It's yours. Nobody can take it from you. The sea always healed you." Margery turned her head. She angled her good eye on her daughter. "That ruin," she said. "It's your ruin, Mama," Wynne said. "It's the one thing in this world that has only ever been yours." And something moved in Margery. Then something very old, something that had been buried under 50 years of being Mrs. Bennett Ashworth. The voice of her grandmother, Adelaide, dry and sharp, came up out of the bottom of her memory as clearly as if the old woman were sitting on the couch beside her. "This is your ground, child, and no man, no court, no living soul can take your ground from you." She packed 2 suitcases. She packed her sewing basket and her quilting frame. She packed a photograph of her parents and a photograph of Adelaide. And from the cedar box at the bottom of her closet, the one she had not opened in 50 years, she took out the small black walnut cup her grandmother had served her sassafras tea in the long August afternoons of her childhood. The cup had survived every move of her life by accident, the way some things do, packed and unpacked and forgotten in the back of one closet after another. She wrapped it in a tea towel and laid it on top of the clothes in her suitcase. She closed the lid. Wind drove her down on a Saturday morning in early May, 90 miles south down I-95 off at the Cypress Landing exit, 15 more miles east on a 2-lane road through pine flats and salt marsh, until the smell of the sea came in through the open window, and the road ended at the edge of the old town. The house was there. Of course it was. It had been there for 140 years. Limestone walls weathered the color of bone, a sagging cedar porch ivy growing up the north side, the marsh grass running back behind it to the water. Margery stood at the gate with her one good eye and looked at the house her husband had called a ruin. She did not know on that morning what the house was worth. She did not know what was coming. She knew only that the house was hers and that she was, for the first time in 52 years, standing on a piece of ground that no man on earth could take away from her. She pushed the gate open. She walked up the path. She put her hand on the door. That night, 3 different men in expensive suits would, in 3 different offices in 3 different cities, look at 3 different maps of the Cypress Landing coastline and circle with 3 different pens the lot the limestone house was sitting on. But Margery did not know that yet. She did not know yet that the United States Department of the Interior had just 5 years earlier in 2020 designated the entire historic district of Cypress Landing as a National Coastal Heritage District. She did not know that property values in the town had quadrupled in the last 3 years. She did not know that her ruin, the rotting pile by a salt marsh, was sitting on what was now considered one of the most valuable single residential lots on the entire Georgia coast. She knew only that she was home. She did not yet know that she had been left by the man who had spent a lifetime despising this place, a fortune he could not see. But she would learn, and he would learn, and in the end, the only one of them who would understand what any of it had ever been worth was the 80-year-old woman standing on the porch in the May light, with her grandmother's walnut cup in her hand, listening to the sea. She slept that first night on a folding cot Wynne had set up in what used to be the front parlor, under the high cedar beams that Bennett had sworn for 40 years were about to come down. The beams did not come down. They had not come down in 140 years, and they did not come down that night. Margery lay on the cot in the dark and listened to the house. An old house makes a particular kind of sound when the tide goes out at midnight, a long, slow settling, as if it is letting out a breath it has been holding all day. She listened to that breath. She listened to the marsh frogs. She listened to her own heart, which for the first time in months was beating at a pace she recognized. She woke at first light. She did not, the way she had woken every morning for 52 years in Savannah, reach for the small bedside clock to see what time Bennett would want his breakfast. She woke and she lay there a moment and she remembered where she was. And then she got up and she put on her house dress and her old canvas shoes and she walked through the dim rooms of the house to the back door and she opened it and she stepped out into the rear lot. The sassafras tree was there. Of course it was. Sassafras, once it takes hold in a piece of low country ground, does not leave. The tree she remembered from her childhood was long dead by 2025. But its descendants had spread the way sassafras spreads through suckers and runners and stubborn refusal, until what had been one tree was now a small thicket along the back fence. The leaves were the same, the mitten-shaped leaves she had learned to recognize at the age of 6. She broke one off and held it to her nose and smelled faintly root beer and the deep woods. She dug a few roots with an old garden trowel she found rusting on the back step. She washed them under the kitchen tap. The kitchen tap miraculously still worked. She found a battered enamel pot under the sink. She set water to boil on the gas stove, which also miraculously worked, because Earl Pritchard, the old fisherman she had been paying $80 a month for 40 years to keep an eye on the place, had quietly kept the propane tank filled the entire time. Even in the years when she had stopped coming, she brewed the tea. She squeezed a lemon from the tree that still bore fruit at the corner of the lot. She unwrapped the small black walnut cup from its tea towel, and she set it on the kitchen table. She poured the tea. She carried the cup out to the front porch to the cedar bench under the arches that her grandmother used to sit on, and she sat down and she lifted the cup to her mouth, and she drank. The taste was the same, bitter green, faintly sweet at the back of the throat, the cool tang of the lemon. It was exactly the taste she remembered from August of 1953 when she had been 8 years old, and her grandmother had been alive, and the world had not yet begun its long, slow work of taking from her. She set the cup down on the bench beside her, and then finally, for the first time since the morning in Savannah, she cried. But it was not the crying of grief. It was something else. It was the crying of a woman who has at last, after a very long absence, come home. She did not move from the bench for a long time. The sun rose over the marsh. The white egrets came up out of the cypresses and flew in a long, ragged line toward the river. Somewhere down the lane, a rooster crowed, and Margery Ashworth, 80 years old, sat on her grandmother's bench and drank her grandmother's tea from her grandmother's cup. And she understood in a way she had not understood at 26 what Adelaide had given her on the morning of her wedding. The town received her slowly. Cypress Landing was not in May of 2025 the empty fishing village it had been in her childhood. But it was not yet either what it was about to become. The Heritage District designation had come down from Washington 5 years earlier, and the slow tide of outside money had been rising ever since, but the old town was still mostly the old town. The same families mostly, the same boats at the dock, the same small post office, the same 2 churches. Roselle Calloway was the first to come by. Roselle was 78, a widow, the daughter and granddaughter of Cypress Landing women, and she ran a small business out of her own kitchen, selling corn cakes and hush puppies, and a particular kind of okra pickle her grandmother had taught her to make. She had heard through the slow telegraph of a small southern town that the Limestone house had a new resident, or rather, an old resident newly returned. And she walked over on the third morning with a basket of corn cakes wrapped in a clean cotton cloth. She knocked on the front door. Margery opened it. The two women looked at each other for a long moment. Two women in their late 70s and early 80s. Each of them angled slightly the way old women angle themselves when their eyes are not what they used to be. And Roselle said, "I knew your grandmama." "Did you?" Margery said. "My mama worked for her one summer," Roselle said. 1956, cleaning. Your grandmama paid her a fair wage and didn't talk down to her, which was rarer than it ought to have been in those days. I was a little girl on her hip when she came to work. Your grandmama gave me a peppermint once. Margery stood in the doorway and looked at this stranger, who was not after all a stranger, and she said, "Would you like a cup of sassafras tea, Mrs. Calloway?" "I would," Roselle said. "And the name is Roselle, or Rosie. Mrs. Calloway is what I get called at the bank." They sat on the front porch and drank the tea and ate the corn cakes. Roselle told her the news of the town, who had died, who had married, who had moved away, who had moved back. And then, because she had been working up to it, she said very carefully, "Margery, you've been gone a long time. You know what's been happening here." "Tell me," Margery said. 5 years back, the federal government named this whole stretch of coast a National Heritage District. There's a big sign out by the highway now. Brings the tourists, brings the money, brings, I am sorry to tell you, the developers. Roselle paused. She looked out at the marsh. There's been folks coming around buying up the old houses, the big ones, the waterfront lots. Folks from Atlanta, folks from up north. They tear them down and they put up these big new things, 6 bedrooms, 4-car garages, swimming pools. Or sometimes they don't tear them down. Sometimes they keep the old shell and put a fortune into the inside. Either way, it changes the town. It already has. Margery considered this. "And my house." Roselle looked at her steadily. "Your house, Margery, is the prettiest single waterfront lot left in Cypress Landing that hasn't been touched. Original construction, heritage era. They are going to come for you. They have probably already started. They had. The first one came on the following Tuesday. A man in his 50s in a navy suit that did not belong on the Cypress Landing dock, driving a black Cadillac sedan with Atlanta plates. He parked at her gate. He walked up the path with the smooth confidence of a man accustomed to opening other people's doors. He knocked. Margery opened. "Ma'am," he said with a smile she had seen 1,000 times in Bennett's friends. "My name is Donovan. I represent a small group of investors interested in historic properties along the Georgia coast. I wonder if you might have a few minutes." She did not invite him in. She stood in the doorway with her good eye angled on him, and she said, "I'm not selling, sir." "Ma'am, I haven't even made an offer." "You don't need to. I am not selling." "Could I at least leave you my card?" She let him leave the card. She closed the door. She put the card in the kitchen drawer and forgot about it until that evening when she remembered, and took it out and looked at it, and saw that the number on the back, written in pencil in the man's own hand, was $900,000. She set the card down on the kitchen table. She sat looking at it for a long time. $900,000. For the ruin. For the rotting pile by a salt marsh. She did not call Wynne that night. She did not call anybody. She sat with the number and she let it sit, and after a while she got up and made herself a second cup of sassafras tea and carried it back out to the porch and watched the moon come up over the marsh. The card stayed on the kitchen table. She did not in the end do anything about it, but she did not throw it away. The second offer came on Thursday. A woman, this time in a linen suit with a manila folder under her arm. The number on her card, written more boldly in ink, was 1,200,000. The third came the following Monday, the fourth on Wednesday, and on the second Friday in May the fifth came. A man named Hargrove, broad-shouldered, red-faced, sweating a little in the midday heat, who did not bother with the courtesies the others had observed. He had clearly been told that the previous offers had failed. He stood at her gate, and he said with an edge of impatience that the others had been too polished to show. "Ma'am, look, I'm going to be straight with you. You don't know what you've got sitting on. This property, With the original structure on the Heritage Register with that marsh frontage is worth more than you can probably imagine. This is a fortune, ma'am, a fortune. And with respect, you are not a young woman. You don't have many years left to enjoy it. Sell to me. Live comfortable. Let somebody who knows what to do with this place do it. A fortune. He left when she asked him to. He left her his card, which she did not look at. But the word stayed. A fortune. The ruin. The rotting pile. A fortune. She did not sleep that night. She lay on the cot in the front parlor with the windows open and the marsh breathing in and out beyond the porch. And she ran the word over and over in her mind, like a stone she was working smooth between her fingers. And somewhere in the small hours, somewhere between the moon setting and the first birds, the part of Margery Ashworth that had been a schoolteacher in 1968, the part that had been quiet under the wife for 52 years, woke up. The teacher woke up, and she did not go back to sleep. She got up at first light. She made herself a cup of tea, but she did not carry it out to the porch this morning. She carried it to the kitchen table, and she sat down with a yellow legal pad she had asked Wynne to bring her, and she began in her careful schoolteacher's handwriting to think. She wrote down the 5 offers: 900,000, 1,200,000, 1,400,000, 1,600,000. Mr. Hargrove had not written a number, but she suspected he would have gone higher than the others. She looked at the column of numbers. She looked at the rising pattern, and she understood that the men in the suits, all 5 of them, knew something she did not. And she understood that as long as she did not know what they knew, she was at their mercy. And she had spent 52 years at the mercy of men who knew things she did not, and she was this morning finished with that. Done. Forever. She picked up the phone and she called Wynne in Macon. "Sugar," she said when her daughter answered. "I need you to find me an appraiser, a real one, an honest one. Somebody from out of town, Charleston maybe, or Atlanta. Not anybody connected to your father. Not anybody who has ever met your father. Somebody who will come down here and tell me in writing what this house and this lot are actually worth." There was a pause on the other end. Then Wynne said, "Mama, are you all right?" "I'm better than all right, sugar. I am tired of guessing what men know that I don't. I want a number, in writing, on a piece of paper that says what this place is." "I'll find somebody," Wynne said. "Give me a week." The appraiser came down from Charleston 10 days later. His name was Mr. Lyle. He was in his 40s, quiet, careful, the kind of professional who measures twice before he speaks once. He walked the lot with a tape and a clipboard. He examined the limestone walls, the original cedar beams, the heart pine flooring under the dust. He took photographs of everything. He sat at the kitchen table and asked Margery a great many questions about the construction date of the house, about the deed history, about the heritage register status of the structure. He made notes in a small leather notebook. He stayed 5 hours. When he left, he told her he would have her a written appraisal within 3 weeks. While she waited, 2 other things happened that mattered. The first was that Margery, on Wynne's gentle insistence, opened the cedar box from her closet, which she had had Wynne ship down from Savannah, along with the rest of her things. She had not opened it in 50 years. She opened it now. Her mother's pearls were there, yellowed in their velvet pouch. Her father's pocket watch, which had stopped at 4:20 on some afternoon in 1981. And underneath both, in a manila envelope, sealed with a strip of brown paper tape that had gone brittle with age, was the document Adelaide Hollis had handed her on the morning of her wedding in April of 1972. Margery cut the tape with a kitchen knife. She slid the papers out. She put on her reading glasses. She tilted her head to bring her good eye to bear, and she read line by line the irrevocable living trust her grandmother had created for her in February of 1972 in the office of Mr. Pemberton on Abercorn Street in Savannah. She read it twice. She read it a third time. And she sat back in the kitchen chair, and she said quietly to the empty room, oh, Grandma, you knew." She called Wynne again. She read her daughter the relevant paragraphs over the phone. Wynne in Macon sat down hard on her own kitchen chair. "Mama," Wynne said. "Mama, does Daddy know about this?" "He has to," Margery said. "He's a lawyer. He would have looked. He would have known from the beginning." "Then why?" Wynne said. And then she stopped because she understood the answer before she finished the question. Bennett knew. He had always known. The house had never been within his reach. He had not given it to Margery out of generosity. He had given it because he could not have taken it. "I want to talk to a lawyer," Margery said. "A new one. Not Hadley. Not anybody from your father's world. Somebody young, somebody honest, somebody from outside Savannah." Wynne knew a young attorney in Macon named Mr. Whitfield, who had handled her own husband's small business matters, and who had impressed her with his plain manner and his refusal to charge for things that did not need charging for. She set up the meeting. Margery rode up to Macon with her in the second week of June. They sat in Mr. Whitfield's small office on a side street, and Mr. Whitfield read slowly and carefully the documents Margery had brought with her. When he was finished, he set the papers down. He looked at Margery over his reading glasses. He said, "Mrs. Ashworth, your grandmother locked this down like Fort Knox in 1972. The trust is irrevocable. The property is yours free and clear, separate property in every sense the state of Georgia recognizes. Your divorce settlement does not touch it. Your ex-husband has no claim, never had a claim, and could not acquire a claim if he hired every lawyer between here and Atlanta. This piece of ground has been entirely yours, legally untouchable, for 52 years. Margery tilted her head and looked at the young lawyer with her good eye. She smiled very slightly. "She knew Mr. Whitfield," she said. "My grandmother knew. The old women knew things that didn't come out of your law books." The second thing that happened while she waited for the appraisal was the Autumn Fish Festival. Cypress Landing held it every year on the last Saturday in September, the Red Drum Festival, a small local thing with boats decorated in flowers and a procession down to the dock, blessing the boats and the men who worked them and asking the sea for a good winter run. Margery went with Roselle. They stood on the wooden dock in the late afternoon light and watched the boats go out. Earl Pritchard's old shrimper passed close to the dock, and Earl, who was 76 and had not smiled at anybody in years, lifted his hand to her as he passed, and Margery lifted her hand back, and Roselle leaned over and said in her ear, "Miss Bird, that man has been waiting 40 years for you to come back." "Hush, Roselle. I am only telling you what I see. You see too much. I am old enough to." The two women laughed there on the dock. Two old women laughing in the autumn light. And Margery thought with a sudden small clarity that she would remember this afternoon for the rest of her life. She walked home alone in the dusk. The envelope was wedged under her front door. A large manila envelope with the return address of Lyle Appraisal Services, Charleston, South Carolina, printed in the upper left corner. The appraisal had arrived. She picked it up. She carried it inside. She did not open it immediately. She made herself a cup of sassafras tea because by now the ritual had become the thing that anchored her to herself. And she carried the cup and the envelope out to the cedar bench on the front porch, and she set the cup on the bench beside her, and she opened the envelope. The cover letter was polite and brief. The appraisal itself ran to 43 pages. Photographs, comparable sales, heritage register notations, land valuations, construction valuations, premium for original heritage-era structure on protected coastline, premium for unencumbered waterfront, premium for lot size. She tilted her head. She moved her good right eye slowly down the columns. She turned the pages. And then, near the back of the document on a single line set off in bold type, she found it, the number. Fair market valuation of the subject property as of the date of inspection, $2,400,000. She read it once. She read it twice. She counted the zeros with the tip of her index finger, the way she had counted points on a quilt for 40 years. 2,400,000. She sat very still. The marsh frogs began their evening chorus. A heron flew low across the water. She did not gasp. She did not weep. She did not, in the end, do anything dramatic at all. She set the appraisal down on her lap. She picked up the Walnut Cup. She drank the rest of her tea. And then in the gathering dusk on the front porch of her grandmother's house, Margery Ashworth, 80 years old, did something she had not done in 52 years. She laughed. A short, dry laugh. The laugh of a woman who at last has understood the joke. $2.4 million, the ruin, the rotting pile. Bennett, with his 2 good eyes and his law degree and his 52 years of arranging the world to his advantage, had not been able to see the fortune sitting 90 miles south of him for half a century. Because to see it, you had to love the place. And he never loved any place but himself. She called Win that night. She told her the number. Win was silent for a long moment on the other end, and then she said very carefully, "Mama, you have to tell Daddy." "No," Margery said, "I do not." "But Mama, the satisfaction of it, the vindication. You could walk into his house and put that paper on his desk and let him see what he threw away." "Sugar," Margery said. "Listen to me. I spent 52 years of my life needing that man to look at me a certain way, needing him to see me, needing him to value me. And I did not get that look. Not once. Not on our wedding day, not when our children were born, not on my 60th birthday, not on our 50th anniversary, not ever. He never looked at me the way I wanted to be looked at. And do you know what I figured out sitting on this porch this evening? I do not need that look anymore. I am 80 years old, and I am free of needing his eyes on me. Walking into his house with this paper would be needing his eyes again. It would be needing him to see me lose, even if losing meant winning. And I will not give him that. Not anymore. Let him keep his big house on East Jones Street. Let him keep his orange trees and his walnut furniture and his eldest son. Let him die believing he won. I have the ground. I have the peace. And that is something he could not buy with $2.4 million, or with $24 million, or with any sum a man like that could put his hands on. Win was quiet a long time. Then she said in a voice that was not quite her usual voice, "Yes, Mama, all right, Mama." It was the voice of a daughter recognizing perhaps for the first time that her mother had become a person she did not entirely know. The pressure began 2 weeks later. It began the way these things always begin, with a small unpleasantness that could be explained away as an accident. Margery came out one morning to find that several bags of construction trash had been dumped just inside her front gate. Broken concrete, splintered lumber. The kind of thing a dishonest contractor leaves wherever he can leave it. She did not call anybody. She got a pair of work gloves from the shed, and she pulled the bags out into the lane herself, and she called the county to come pick them up. 3 days later, a man arrived at her gate in a county vehicle wearing a clipboard and a name tag that said Mason. He said he was from code enforcement. He said there had been an anonymous complaint about her structure being unsafe and a public hazard. He wanted to inspect. Margery, polite and careful, asked him for his identification, which he produced, and then asked him very politely whether he might also produce the business card she could see sticking out of his shirt pocket. The business card belonged to an Atlanta development firm whose name had appeared on one of the offers she had received in May. Mr. Mason from Code Enforcement turned a color Margery had not seen on a human face in some time. He left. She did not see him again. The water was cut off the following Tuesday with no explanation. Earl Pritchard, when she mentioned it to him at the dock, walked her down to the town water office that same afternoon and stood next to her silent and large while she calmly inquired why her service had been interrupted. The water was restored by sundown. The Sunday after that, she came out onto her front porch in the morning to find that someone had painted in black spray paint a large rough X on the limestone wall beside her front door. She stood looking at it for a long moment. She did not call the sheriff. She did not call Win. She walked back inside and made her tea. That evening, just before sundown, Earl Pritchard came up the lane with 3 other men. They were all in their 70s. They were all old fishermen. They all walked with the slight roll that a man who has spent 50 years on a boat walks with. They did not say anything when they reached her gate. Earl carried in a soft canvas case his old over and under shotgun. The other 3 carried theirs. They walked up onto her porch. They set the cases against the wall. They sat down on the porch in 4 old rocking chairs that had been there since the resin years. "Earl," Margery said from the doorway, "what are you doing?" "Sitting on your porch, Miss Bird." "For how long?" "Long as it takes." She did not argue. She made them coffee. They sat there until the moon came up, 4 old men with shotguns leaning against the limestone wall, not speaking much, watching the lane. Nobody came down the lane that night. Nobody came the next night either. Nobody painted any more crosses on her wall, and nobody dumped any more construction trash at her gate, and the small ugly war of attrition that had been building against her in the last weeks of September very quietly ended. But Win that same week took matters further. She called an old friend from her nursing school days whose husband worked at the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. The husband was working that fall on a long investigative piece about predatory development in the heritage districts of coastal Georgia. He drove down to Cypress Landing the first week in October. He sat with Margery on her porch for 2 hours. He drank her sassafras tea. He took a photograph in the late afternoon light, on the cedar bench with the marsh behind her and the small walnut cup in her hand, and her head angled the way she always angled it to see him with her good eye. The article ran on the front page of the Sunday paper, October the 19th, 2025. The last guardian of Cypress Landing. An 80-year-old retired schoolteacher refuses to sell the heritage house that greed wants to tear down. By Tuesday morning, the story had been picked up by 3 other newspapers, and one national magazine had called for the rights to reprint it. By Friday, a national morning television show had asked politely whether Mrs. Ashworth would consent to an interview. She did not. But the photograph of her on her porch with the cup with her head angled with the marsh behind her had spread. The offers stopped coming. The men in suits did not appear at her gate again. The anonymous complaints to the county ceased. The campaign of small ugliness ended as quickly and as quietly as it had begun, because the kind of money that had been moving against her could not afford the publicity it would have taken to keep moving against her, and so it withdrew. Roselle Calloway said it best one evening on the dock, when the two of them were watching the sun set behind the cypresses. She said, "Miss Bird, you know why we don't want them here? It is not because they are rich. There has always been rich folks in this country. It is because they come to a place they do not love, and they put a price on every single thing that has no price. The marsh, the egrets, the light on the water in the evening, your house. They put a price on it. And what has a price can be bought. And what can be bought they destroy. You did not sell them your house. You did something better. You told them your house has no price. And that drives a certain kind of man crazy, because he cannot understand that there is anything in this world that money cannot buy." Margery looked out at the marsh. She did not answer. There was nothing to add to what Roselle had said. But the story, of course, did not stay in Cypress Landing. It traveled as stories do. It traveled 90 miles north up Interstate 95 into Savannah, into the historic district onto East Jones Street, into a house with iron gates and camellias and a side garden where the tomatoes had been planted again that summer, even though the woman who knew how to grow them was no longer there. Somebody, perhaps Coleman, perhaps an old friend of Bennett's at the club, perhaps simply a Sunday paper folded open on the breakfast table, brought the article into that house. And Bennett Ashworth, 84 years old, sitting in his study with the morning light coming through the French doors and his coffee growing cold beside him, read that the ruin he had thrown away in March was now valued at $2,400,000. He did not say anything. He set the newspaper down. He sat for a long time looking at the photograph of his ex-wife, the woman he had not looked at across a conference table on the morning he ended their 52-year marriage. The woman with her head angled her good eye on the camera, her grandmother's cup in her hand. He picked up a yellow legal pad from his desk. He began to make notes. He worked through the morning. He worked through the afternoon. He worked into the evening. By nightfall, he had filled 6 pages in his careful lawyer's hand with what he believed or had convinced himself to believe was a legal theory. The first envelope from his attorney arrived at the Limestone house in Cypress Landing on the second Monday of November. Margery was on the front porch when the postal carrier brought it up the lane. She tilted her head to see the return address, the law office of Pemberton Hargis and Vale, Savannah, Georgia, the same firm Bennett had used for 40 years. She did not open it on the porch. She carried it inside. She set it on the kitchen table. She made herself a cup of sassafras tea. She sat down. She put on her reading glasses, and then with her good eye she read slowly and carefully the document that Bennett Ashworth had paid his old firm to draft. It was a civil complaint. It had been filed 3 days earlier in Chatham County Superior Court. The plaintiff was Bennett Ashworth. The defendant was Margery Ashworth. He was suing her for partial ownership of the house in Cypress Landing. She read the complaint twice. She set it down on the kitchen table. She did not this time laugh. She did not cry either. She sat looking at the document with her good eye for a long, quiet moment. And what she felt she would later tell Wynne was not anger and not surprise. What she felt was something closer to recognition. The way a person feels when a thing they have been half expecting finally arrives. Of course he had sued her. Of course. A man who has spent 84 years arranging the world so that he is the one holding the pen does not, when he discovers he has thrown away $2.4 million, simply absorb the loss and go on with his life. A man like that fights. A man like that finds a theory. A man like that pays his old firm to write up a complaint that he himself knows in the part of him that is still a lawyer and not yet entirely a fool cannot win. The theory, when she read it carefully, was almost embarrassing. Bennett's attorneys had reached for the doctrine of commingling, that quiet old principle by which separate property can sometimes lose its separate character if it has been mixed with marital assets in such a way that the two can no longer be cleanly distinguished. They argued that for 52 years, the Ashworth marital household had paid certain expenses associated with the Cypress Landing property. The $80 a month to Earl Pritchard for upkeep, the property taxes, a new roof in 1994. They argued that these payments had been made from marital funds, had benefited the separate property, and had therefore converted some portion of the house into a marital asset subject to equitable division. It was a thin argument. It was a paper-thin argument. Margery, who was not a lawyer, could see the holes in it as clearly as she could see the holes in a quilt she had stitched badly when she was 12. The taxes had been paid for most of those years from a small income account that Adelaide had set up alongside the trust in 1972 specifically to cover such expenses. The $80 a month to Earl was a sum so trivial that no court would entertain it as evidence of commingling. The new roof in 1994 had been paid for, she suddenly remembered, by her mother's small estate. Lucinda had died that spring, and the $4,000 she left her only daughter had gone straight to a roofer in Cypress Landing. It was a losing case. Bennett knew it was a losing case. He had not filed it to win. He had filed it because winning was not the point. The point was to make her tired. The point was to drag her, an 80-year-old woman with one good eye, through the courts of Chatham County for as long as it took to break her. The point was to make her eventually, in some weak moment, offer him a settlement, a few $100,000, a piece of the eventual sale, something, anything, so that he could go to his grave with at least a small piece of the fortune he had thrown away. It was the oldest play in the book, the same play the developers had run: exhaust the old woman, make her tired, make her afraid, make her give up. They were all betting, every last one of them, on the same thing. They were betting that a woman of 80, living alone in a low-country town with one of her 3 children steady at her side, and the other 2 ranged against her, would in the end break. They were betting on the wrong woman. She called Mr. Whitfield in Macon that afternoon. She read him the complaint over the phone. He listened. When she was finished, he was quiet for a long moment, and then he laughed. A short, dry, professional laugh. "Mrs. Ashworth," he said, "your ex-husband is an attorney. He has practiced in Chatham County for 40 years. He knows as well as I do, as well as any first-year law student knows, that this complaint will not survive a motion to dismiss. The doctrine of commingling does not apply to the facts he is alleging. And even if it did apply, the dollar amounts at issue are so small relative to the value of the trust corpus that no court of equity in this state would convert the property based on them. He is trying to frighten you. If you do not frighten, he will pay sanctions for filing in bad faith, because his own pleadings establish that he knew at the time of the divorce that the property was separate. He admitted as much in the settlement negotiations. We can prove it." "Then he gets nothing," Margery said. "Not 1 cent, ma'am, not 1 stone of your house. And he will know by the end of it that I was not afraid." "He will know," Mr. Whitfield said. "I will make sure he knows." She hung up the phone. She sat in the kitchen of her grandmother's house with the late afternoon light coming through the window, and the smell of sassafras still in the air from the morning's tea, and she felt for the first time in 53 years the particular still center of a woman who is afraid of no one. Not her ex-husband, not his firm, not any court, not anyone. The litigation moved slowly. It moved slowly in Georgia. Bennett's attorneys filed and refiled, requested continuances, demanded discovery. They did not need scheduled depositions. They cancelled, took the calendar by the throat, the way an experienced lawyer takes a calendar. November turned into December, and December into January. The Cypress Landing. Winter came in grey and cold by low-country standards, the marsh grass bleached pale, and the cypresses dropping their needles. Margery wore a wool shawl on the porch in the afternoons. The Sassafras Tea was hotter now, and she held the Walnut Cup with both hands. Wind drove down from Macon for every hearing. The drive was 3 hours each way. She would arrive the night before sleep in the small back bedroom Margery had fixed up with linens from a department store in Brunswick. And the next morning, the two of them would dress and get into Wynn's Honda and drive the 90 minutes north to Savannah to the Chatham County Courthouse on Wright Square. Margery wore the same outfit to every hearing, a pressed cotton dress in navy or gray, low-heeled shoes, a small string of pearls her mother had left her hair pinned up neatly. She sat very straight in the gallery, and when she was called to her counsel's table, she walked the short distance with the deliberate small steps of a woman who has decided to give the room no excuse to think of her as frail. Bennett arrived at every hearing flanked by two young attorneys in dark suits. He did not look at her, not once. The man who for 52 years had looked through her as if she were a piece of furniture in the room, could not, now that she was the woman across the aisle from him in a Georgia courtroom, find the strength to lift his eyes to her face. He looked at his papers. He looked at his attorneys. He looked at the judge. He did not look at Margery. She noticed. Of course she noticed. And what she felt in noticing was not triumph. It was a quiet, small recognition that the man across the aisle had become in a way she had not entirely understood, until now a smaller human being than she was. She had wanted his look for 52 years. The day she stopped wanting it was the day he could no longer give it. The case was scheduled for its substantive hearing on the third Tuesday of February 2026, a Tuesday morning. 10 o'clock before Judge Beaufort Coleman of the Chatham County Superior Court, who had been on the bench for 31 years and was known throughout the Georgia bar as a man of low patience for the manipulation of his courtroom. 3 days before the hearing on a Saturday afternoon in February, Margery was on her front porch with her quilting frame. She was finishing a quilt she had begun in October, a low-country star pattern in pale blues and grays, the colors of the marsh in winter. She heard a vehicle in the lane. She did not look up. Vehicles came down the lane sometimes. It was usually nothing. The vehicle stopped at her gate. A door opened and shut. Footsteps came up the path. Margery looked up. It was Garrett, her middle son, the contractor, the one who had taken the lot in Statesboro and stayed silent. He was 48 years old, 6 feet tall, broad through the shoulders, dressed in the kind of work clothes a man wears who has spent 20 years on construction sites. He had not been to Cypress Landing in 15 years. He stopped at the bottom of the porch steps. He looked up at his mother, and his face was a face Margery had not seen on her son since he was 9 years old, and had broken a window with a baseball, and had come to her white and frightened to confess. "Mama," he said, "Garrett, can I come up?" "You can sit down." He climbed the steps. He sat on the cedar bench. The same bench Adelaide had sat on, the same bench Margery sat on every evening with her tea. He sat with his elbows on his knees and his hands hanging between them. And he did not speak for a long moment. The marsh wind moved in the cedars. A heron called from somewhere down the water. "Mama," he said finally, "I have to tell you something." "All right, son." "I made an arrangement with Daddy before the divorce. He gave me the Statesboro lot at a price that wasn't a price. In exchange, I promised I wouldn't take your side. I wouldn't speak against the settlement. I wouldn't interfere." Margery did not look up from her quilting. She made one careful stitch, then another. "I know that, son. I have known it since April." He nodded slowly. He had clearly expected that. "Wynn told you." "She told me." "Mama." "Garrett, I'm not going to make this easy. I am 80 years old. I do not have the energy to make difficult things easy for grown men." "No, ma'am." He sat a while longer. The afternoon light slanted in across the porch. He pulled at the calluses on his hands. "My wife is leaving me, Mama." Margery stopped quilting. She looked up. Lindsay read the article in the Atlanta paper, the one in October. She read it twice. And then she came into the kitchen and she said, "Garrett, sit down." And she sat down across from me and she said, "I cannot raise my children with a man who helped his daddy do that to his mother. I cannot. I love you. I have loved you 18 years. But I will not have my boys watch their father do something like that and learn that it is all right." She moved out the next week. She has filed. She means it. Margery did not say anything for a long time. She set the quilting frame aside. She folded her hands in her lap. Lindsay is a good woman, Garrett. Yes, ma'am. Better than you deserve, son. Yes, ma'am. I know that, ma'am. He looked at her, and his eyes were wet. But he was not crying because he was a man of 48 who had been raised in South Georgia and did not cry in front of his mother. He said, "Mama, the hearing is Tuesday. I will testify. I will get up on that stand in front of Judge Coleman, in front of Daddy, in front of God and everybody, and I will tell them about the Statesboro deal. I will tell them exactly what Daddy did. I will give them the documentation. It will end him in this town. He will not practice again, even retired. The bar will look at it. I will do it. For you, I will do it." Margery looked at her son, her middle child, the boy who had been quiet at 6 and quieter at 16, and had grown into a man whose silences she had spent 20 years trying to read. She thought about it. She let him sit there in the silence and feel the weight of his offer. She thought about what it would do to Bennett in open court in front of every lawyer in Savannah to have his own son testify to his rotten little scheme. She thought about how it would feel to watch. And then she shook her head. "No, son, Mama. You do not need to testify, Garrett. The judge will see through your father without your help. The case is going to fall on his head in any event. Mr. Whitfield has prepared it. There is nothing your testimony adds that the documents do not already prove. Mama, please, let me do this. Let me do something. Listen to me, Garrett. Listen carefully. If you testify, you do it for the wrong reason. You do it because you want your wife back. You do it because you want me to forgive you. You do it because you want to be able to look at yourself in the mirror again. Those are reasons, son, but they are not good enough reasons. Testimony in a court of law is not a way to make yourself feel better about something you have already done." "Then what do I do, Mama?" "You go home. You go to Lindsay. You tell her you understand why she did what she did. You tell her you are not going to fight her on anything in the divorce. You give her the boys for however much she wants, and you do not contest anything, and you do not try to keep what you got from your daddy. You sell that Statesboro lot, son. You sell it tomorrow. And whatever the profit is, you put it in a trust for your boys, and you make sure your name is not on it. And you make sure Lindsay is the trustee. You do not benefit from a single dollar of what your father gave you in exchange for selling your mother out. Not $1. Do you understand me?" "Yes, ma'am. And then you start, son. You start a long, slow road of becoming a man you can look at again. It will take you the rest of your life, and you may never get all the way there. But you start. And you do not start by getting up on a stand in Chatham County and putting your father in the ground. You start by giving back what you took. That is how it begins." Garrett sat for a long time. The light went lower. The cedars moved. "Yes, ma'am," he said. "Now." "Mama." "Yes, son. Thank you for telling me. Thank you for coming to tell me." She paused. "It took something. I will not pretend it did not take something." He stood up. He came over to her. He bent down. He kissed the top of her head the way he had kissed her when he was 8 years old leaving for school. And then he walked back down the porch steps and back down the path and got in his truck and drove away. Margery sat with the quilt in her lap until full dark. She did not cry. She did not pray. She sat with the long, slow work of being a mother to a son who had failed her, and she let the work do what it needed to do. And when the moon came up over the marsh, she got up and she made herself a fresh cup of tea, and she carried it inside and she went to bed. The hearing was on Tuesday morning at 10. The courtroom was full. The Atlanta article had drawn observers. The Savannah bar, that small and gossipy world, had heard rumors. 3 reporters sat in the back row. Roselle Calloway had driven up with Earl Pritchard, the two of them, in their Sunday clothes, sitting 4 rows behind Margery in the gallery. Wynne sat next to her mother. Coleman, the eldest son, sat behind his father, on the plaintiff's side, his hands folded, his face carefully arranged. Garrett did not come. Margery had asked him not to. Bennett's lead attorney, a man in his 50s named Hargis, presented the argument first. He did it well in the technical sense. He laid out the doctrine of commingling. He cited the property tax payments, the upkeep payments, the 1994 roof. He argued that 52 years of marital expenditure on the separate property had transformed it in equity into a partial marital asset. He spoke for 40 minutes. When he sat down, the courtroom was very quiet. Mr. Whitfield, in his plain dark suit, did not stand immediately. He waited a beat. He looked once at his notes, which were spare, and then he rose, and in less than 15 minutes, with the patient calm of a man who has prepared his case, he dismantled Hargis's argument piece by piece. The tax payments had come from the trust's own income account, not from marital funds. He had the bank statements. The roof had been paid for by Lucinda Hollis's estate, not by Mr. and Mrs. Ashworth. He had the probate record. The upkeep payments to Earl Pritchard were de minimis under any standard the Georgia courts had ever applied. And finally, most damaging of all, in the original settlement negotiations of March 2025, Mr. Ashworth's own counsel had stipulated in writing that the Cypress Landing property was the separate property of the defendant and was not subject to division. Mr. Whitfield had the stipulation. He held it up. He laid it on the bench. When he sat down, the courtroom was very quiet. Judge Beaufort Coleman, 70 years old, white-haired, took a long moment. He removed his reading glasses. He polished them on a handkerchief. He set the handkerchief aside. He looked for a long moment not at the attorneys but at the plaintiff. "Mr. Ashworth," he said. Bennett looked up. "Mr. Ashworth, you practiced law in this state for 41 years. You retired in good standing. You are a member of this bar with the kind of professional history that ordinarily commands respect in this courtroom." The judge paused. "Lawyer to lawyer, sir. Do you genuinely believe you have any legal right to that house?" The courtroom held its breath. Margery in the gallery tilted her head with her good eye on her ex-husband's profile. Wynne beside her did not move. Bennett opened his mouth. He closed it. He opened it again. He said in a voice that was not quite the baritone of 50 years in courtrooms, "Your Honor, the principles of equity. 52 years of shared sacrifice. The contributions of a long marriage, I believe." He stopped. He could not finish the sentence. Judge Coleman put his reading glasses back on. He made a small note on the pad in front of him. He said very quietly, "That will be sufficient, counsel." It was over in that moment before any ruling had been entered. Every lawyer in the room knew it. Every reporter knew it. The Savannah Bar by that night would know it. Bennett Ashworth, who had spent 40 years building his name in this courthouse, had been unable to answer lawyer to lawyer whether he believed his own complaint. And in that inability, in front of his colleagues, in front of his son Coleman, in front of his ex-wife, he had lost not the case but the thing that had mattered to him more than any case ever had. He had lost his face. The written order came down 3 weeks later. The complaint was dismissed in its entirety. Sanctions were entered against Bennett Ashworth personally, in the amount of $46,000 payable to the defendant within 60 days on the courts, finding that the action had been pursued in bad faith, and with full knowledge by the plaintiff, an experienced attorney, that no legal basis for the claim existed. Wynne called her mother the morning the order arrived. She was laughing. She could barely get the words out. "Mama, we won, we won. They sanctioned him. Mama, can you believe it?" Margery on the porch with her cup of sassafras tea and the late winter light on the marsh smiled. She did not laugh. She did not crow. "That is good sugar," she said. "But I already won. I won the day I walked up onto this porch in May. The order is just a piece of paper saying what I already knew." Bennett never apologized. He never came to Cypress Landing. He never picked up the phone. He paid the $46,000 through his attorneys on the 59th day by certified check. And then he went home to the house on East Jones Street, and he sat in his study, and the rest of his life began the slow, narrow descent of a man who has been seen finally and publicly for what he is, and who has not the strength of character to become anything else. He lived another 4 years. He died in the spring of 2030 in the house on East Jones Street, alone the way men like that almost always die. Coleman handled the estate. Margery did not attend the funeral. She did not feel any need to. With Coleman, there was no reconciliation. After the sanctions order, he made a careful approach. Phone calls, a visit to Cypress Landing, the first he had ever made. He sat on her porch and drank her sassafras tea and made small, careful conversation about his children and his work. And Margery received him the way a mother receives a grown son she no longer trusts. She fed him. She was polite. She did not let him pretend that anything had changed. And when he left in the late afternoons, the two of them understood without saying so. That what was between them now was not love, but a long, polite distance that would last for the rest of her life. It did. He came twice a year after that, at Christmas and on her birthday, and she received him the same way each time, and that was all. Garrett did what she had told him. He sold the Statesboro lot in March. He put the entire profit in trust for his 2 boys with Lindsay as trustee. He did not contest the divorce. Lindsay did not in the end take him back, but she allowed him to be a father to their sons, in a way Margery, watching from a distance, could see was hard-won and slow and real. He began driving down to Cypress Landing 1 weekend a month. He did not come into the house at first. He came to help Earl Pritchard with whatever needed doing. A new section of porch, repairs to the roof, clearing brush from the back lot. He worked. He did not ask his mother for anything. After about a year of this, Margery began inviting him to lunch on the Saturdays he came down. After 2 years, he began bringing his boys with him. They learned to drink sassafras tea. They made faces at the bitterness. They came to like it. Wynne brought her own children down often, then her grandchildren when they came. The 4 generations of women Adelaide had said the trust for 93 years before the story ended began to gather on the limestone porch in the late afternoons, drinking tea from the Walnut Cup or from the new cups Wynne had ordered to match it. Watching the egrets cross the marsh, listening to the boats come in. The house Bennett Ashworth had called a ruin became in those last years what Adelaide Hollis had always known it could be. A place where the women of a family gathered on a piece of ground no man could take. Margery taught reading to the children of Cypress Landing on Saturday afternoons. She did not charge. She set up 2 long tables in the front parlor, and she taught them the way she had taught the mountain children of Blue Ridge in 1968, with patience, with attention, without raising her voice. They called her Miss Bird. The name had begun as a joke about her angled head and her one good eye, and it had become by the second year something close to a title. There were people in Cypress Landing, by the end, who did not know her any other name. She quilted in the mornings. She taught in the afternoons. She drank her tea in the evenings in the Walnut Cup on the cedar bench watching the marsh. She died on a Thursday afternoon in October of 2028. 3 years and 5 months after she had walked up the porch steps for the first time. She was 83 years old. She had been on the bench. The cup was beside her empty. Her face was turned toward the marsh. The egrets were just beginning their evening line across the water. Roselle Calloway found her. Roselle had walked over from her own house with a basket of corn cakes, the way she had walked over 1,000 times in 3 years. She came up the path. She saw her friend on the bench. She understood. She did not call out. She did not run for help. She climbed the steps and she sat down on the bench beside Margery and the 2 old women. One of them alive and one of them just barely. No longer sat there for a long moment in the late October light, watching the egrets cross the marsh. Roselle held her friend's hand. She did not cry, not then. She would cry later in her own kitchen when there was no one to see. But in that moment on the porch, she gave her friend the gift of a quiet sitting. She walked her to the edge of whatever it is people are walked to. Then she got up, she went inside. She called Wynne. The house went to Wynne. Wynne had it titled as her mother had instructed into a new trust structured exactly the way Adelaide's trust had been structured 56 years before for the benefit of Wynne's daughters and granddaughters. Untouchable, locked, theirs. It is still there. It is still standing. No one has sold it. No one will. There are people in Cypress Landing who say, and you can believe this or not as you please, that if you walk past the limestone house at sunset on certain evenings in October, you can smell sassafras boiling in the back kitchen, though there is no one in the kitchen. And they say that on the cedar bench, on the front porch in the last good light before the dark, you can sometimes see the shadow of an old woman, her head tilted slightly, watching the marsh with one good eye perfectly at peace. Bennett Ashworth died believing he had won. He went into his grave never understanding that the woman he had thrown away in March of 2025 had been worth all along more than every visible thing he had taken. Not in dollars. The dollars were the smallest part of it. He had thrown away the only person in 52 years who had ever sat across a table from him and asked nothing of him but to be seen. And he had been unable in all that time to lift his eyes and see her. That was his ruin, not hers. His. A man can spend his whole life believing he's the one holding the pen, and he can be wrong about that from the first signature to the last and never know it. Margery Ashworth knew it. She knew it on the porch with her grandmother's cup in the last light of an October afternoon. She knew it the way the old women had always known things, the things that do not come out of any book of law. Sometimes the greatest fortune we have standing in front of us is the very thing we have spent a lifetime calling a ruin.